made it over the country for Publication Day. Welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you, Sophie. It's good to be here.
In this room filled with shame. I've got some questions, first of all, from people in the office. So, Shame is a book, and it's set mostly in Tanzania, and it's about a woman who runs away from her life. And she's done something quite terrible, but she can't summon enough remorse. How did this idea come to you, this idea of the woman running away, this woman in crisis, trying to find, in a way, an identity in a whole new country?
Well, it's it's odd when you kind of look at stories in different places. I had, a couple of years ago, somewhere like 2004, I think there was a very tragic plane crash in Switzerland, which a plane load of Russian school children collided with a DHL carrier plane, and everyone was killed, so nearly 300 people. And it turned out that it was actually human error by the air traffic controller in Zurich. And one of the fathers of one of the Russian children who had died had tracked down the Polish air controller and stabbed him to death in his garden in Zurich. And the tragedy sort of struck me on many levels. Of course, just the dreadful idea of all these children, but that there was really no sense of justice for the father. Clearly, it had been a human error, and none of the air traffic controllers had been to be struck off or demoted, but no one had actually gone to prison. So I thought, well, he had no sense of justice for what he had lost, because he'd also lost his wife. And the air traffic controller himself, I felt he must have had this terrible sense of guilt and grief, because he was just a normal, moral person. And even for him, there had been no mechanism for atonement, because it was deemed an accident. And I sort of became fascinated by the idea of justice, that if you commit a crime, you go to prison and you serve your time, you atone for your crime in a formal way, and when you come out, you've paid your duty and you can carry on with your life. But if you commit a crime like the air traffic controller, or like Pilgrim does in his book, which is deemed an accident, there's no way you can formally atone for what you've done. And I think that that's really troubling, because we all have a conscience, and so Pilgrim is really haunted by her conscience, and that's compounded by the fact she can't actually remember what she has done. So she's literally like floating in space and trying to grasp at what she should feel and how she should cope with the knowledge that she's done this terrible thing, and how she can possibly atone for it, which she can't.
And part of the novel is about Pilgrim's journey trying to find the right response to what she's done, because simultaneously about before the accident she's been left by her husband. And for a lot of the book, she struggles with these feelings for her husband, and she thinks she should have been feeling for the victims of the crime. Did you really enjoy exploring that ambiguity, this idea of not displaying a socially acceptable response?
Well, I struggled with it, I thought, because in creating Pilgrim, I really felt I needed someone who was very isolated, because most of us, I think, if we did something as terrible as Pilgrim did, we have family, we have friends, we have a support system who could maybe help us through this. We could go to therapy, but I needed to create someone who was seriously isolated. And she had been married to this very charismatic man at a young age and lived a life that sort of precluded forming meaningful attachments. So she comes to this village where she's left by her husband, and she has no one she can turn to, and he of course is run off with a very subpar, different woman. And I think that she really does struggle with the fact that the foremost set of emotions in her mind is her selfish anxiety and being left by her husband. And she knows very well, because she's a moral person, that she should be feeling deep grief for this terrible thing that she's done, and that sort of compounds it, makes it almost worse. It sort of questions her whole moral center as I think, we all would. I mean, if you do what you've done, you should barely be able to move. And all she can think about is, why her stupid husband left her. And that definitely is part of the feeding into her increasingly irrational, and I think not panic ridden, but panicky response to situations.
Because what Pilgrim does in the novel, she goes to the airport, she looks at the departure board, and she gets on the first flight. And she ends up in a part of Tanzania famous for safaris, but then she runs away from her safaris. In a way, she's getting further and further away from herself. And you lived in Tanzania for quite a few years. What came first? Did Pilgrim come first as a character? Or did the setting come first, the wonderful Tanzanian setting that you described?
That's a tricky question, Sophie. Well, obviously the setting. I mean, my last book, Away From You, was set largely in Kenya and Tanzania, and I've always been sort of fascinated with what happens to Westerners when they kind of step through the looking glass that is Africa. And I mean, when I say Africa, I mean the part of Africa I know, Kenya and Tanzania, because everything is different there. The sense of how justice is dispensed is different, how people survive is different. People are living on $1 a day. The struggle of daily life is different. So when you put a Westerner in that context, their ability maybe to see themselves reflected back, I think as a novelist, that's a very useful way to approach it. People, when you really come up against yourself, it's very, very hard to hide and indulge yourself when you're surrounded by people who are actually really struggling to find enough to eat. So I definitely started with the idea of setting it in a remote town in Tanzania and kind of having a character really struggle with essentially a deep moral dilemma.
And superstition and myths plays a very big role in the novel. Tell me a little bit about it, because one of my favourite scenes, the main character, I'm not going to give anything away, but the main character is walking down a beach on the way to see a witch doctor for reasons we'll leave out of play. But tell me a little bit about your experiences with this very different value system and with the idea of witch doctors and sacrifice and these things that Pilgrim does come up against.
Well, I grew up in Kenya, so I sort of grew up with, kinds of those stories were always around. I mean, the gardener who had got very sick, and apparently he had a curse put on him, and so he disappeared for 2 weeks and came back looking healthy and happy. And I asked my nanny, and she said, oh, well, he'd gone down to the coast to meet a very powerful witch doctor, because apparently his brother had put a curse on him over some land squabble. And so he'd gone to this other witch doctor who'd put an even stronger curse on the brother. And so he felt sort of resolved now his curse had been put back. So that was just always sort of the milieu, and kind of everywhere you go, you're aware of. You go to the market, and there's the guy selling his herbal medicines, his herbal potions that can cure everything from AIDS to broken hearts. You go down to the coast, and particularly if you find baobabs, you'll find at the foot of baobabs offerings of rose water and halva fruit. People make offerings. So it's very much part of living there, and I think that witchcraft, healing, and any of this music, it's a long continuum of different aspects and different reasons why people go to see a witch doctor. But I think in some ways that it's a lot like therapy for some people. You go to a witch doctor, you define your intention, what is it you want, and sometimes they can be helpful in a positive way. It's not all just like putting curses on people and the recent spate of Albania. Murder was not recent; it's been going on for many years. So, and it's a religion. I mean, it's probably they suspect there's been some sort of mystical belief system as humans since for 2 million years. So this is old beliefs.
And you talked to begin with about one of the inspirations for the book being the plane crash and the air traffic controller. But I know one of the others is your experience in Tanzania, and in particular when you had to, with the help of a book and some tequila, stitch up a Maasai warrior's face. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, first of all, only a little bit.
Absolutely terrifying.
Only a little bit.
And afterwards, I think.
Well, actually, no, I did have a tiny shot before. Well, we were living in this very remote area, making a film in Crimson for Disney Nature, and we'd only been there for about 2 weeks, and Matt and I, my husband, were taking an afternoon nap, and he kind of looks out and says, I think there's some people here to see you. And surely there was a contingent of about 20 people standing under a tree, and I could see in the midst of them was a sort of figure hunched down. Anyway, so I went over, and the guy was like covered in blood. It was just like soaking in blood. It was pooling around the ground, and they were all looking at me like, well, you know, can you help us? And I'm thinking, well, not really. I mean, I have a first aid kit, but I mean, the guy's face was cut from behind the ear all the way down here to his lip, and it was, you know, it was open. It was a deep knife wound in a drunken fight. So I put him in the car and sent him with a driver across to the other side of the lake, about an hour's drive, because there was a government dispensary there. Well, the driver called me up and he said, oh, the nurse has taken one look at this guy and she's locked the dispensary and run away and hidden. What should we do? And I'm like, I guess he'd better come back, because the only other option was to drive him almost 5 hours at night on a very, very dangerous road. There were lots of bandits around, and that just didn't seem like a viable alternative. So I said, okay, bring him back. And I had this great book, Where There Is No Doctor, which is the Bushmillic's Bible. And that, my husband's mum, is actually a GP, and she had taught me how to do sutures on some pig trotters, just like, you know, one does with my mother.
Good bonding exercise.
Yeah, so I had this suture kit, and I had the book, and so we brought the guy in, and we put him on the kitchen table, and put on my head torch, and I washed my hands, and took a little sip of tequila, and off we went. And I mean, we had no anesthetic, so the guy, he would keep passing out, and every time he'd pass out, I'd desperately try and get as many stitches in as I could. But I have to say, actually, it did a pretty good job. And he staggered off out to the staff kitchen. We gave him some tea, and he slept by the fire. And he got up in the morning, had some breakfast, and walked off. And that was the beginning. Because the next day there were like 20 people standing under the tree, all wanting some sort of medication with some kind of ailment. So that was a whole other chapter.
And now I've got some questions actually from other people.
Okay.
First of all, Jess from marketing wants to know, do you feel sympathy for Pilgrim Jones? I know sympathy and empathy are two very different things, but did you sympathise with her as you were writing?
Well, that's a good question. It's so tricky as a writer. I struggle to make her sympathetic, because obviously somebody who's done what she's done and doesn't show remorse is someone that it's difficult to feel sympathetic for. But I also kind of knew the inner pilgrim. I really struggled with her as a character because she's very passive, and you know, I'm like a lot of young women. If I was Pilgrim's age, you know, have been very proactive in making my choices and going here and going there. And Pilgrim, you know, married young and basically just followed her husband around. And so I think that it was that I found less sympathetic, in that she had never really taken responsibility for herself. She just basically been happy being a wife, married to a powerful and interesting man. And when he left her, she was just sort of paralyzed by that. And I understand it was a very real predicament with the character I created, but she's not someone that I was sympathetic to. And so as a writer, I sort of struggled with having created this character and then also wanting to actually like who I knew she was going to become through this process.
In a way that makes the transformation even more affecting, how she goes from, at the very beginning, almost a hollow shell of someone, into someone who by the end is very proactive. I think all the way through you very much get a sense that she is intelligent. She's quite a caustic wit at some points.
Yeah, I just think she's, you know, I mean, when I was young, my first boyfriend was much older than me. And I remember being very satisfied being with someone who paid all the bills and knew everything, could go to a nice restaurant. And I never really questioned what it meant for me to just be living his life under at his direction. You know, clearly at some point that broke off. But I could have seen I could have just stayed with him and probably would have been a lot like Pilgrim, which is not a bad person, but not somebody who's very fleshed out or very fulfilled. And I think you really do, particularly when you're young, you know, you have to spend time by yourself and face your own demons.
And Pilgrim isn't the only narrator in this book. In fact, she isn't the narrator, but she's not the only viewpoint in the book. And what I really loved about Shame was how you inhabit so many voices equally. So we've got Stabel, who is an aging Austrian policeman, Swiss policeman. We've got Gloria, who's an American who comes to Africa to save AIDS orphans, but is so damaged herself that she projects so many of her own problems on people, including Pilgrim. How and when did you decide to go for all these different viewpoints, and how did that idea come? Because it works absolutely beautifully. What I love is how you inhabit these voices equally almost.
I started out with this idea of a terrible event. I was thinking to you earlier. So wonderful Herman has a quote about within every sin is a moment of grace, and that this terrible thing had happened, but that the consequences that might come of that might be very positive. You just could never tell how far out those rings of influence are going to go. And so I wanted the book ultimately to be positive about good things that happen from something really terrible, and redemption and atonement. Because how do you possibly make something positive out of this terrible tragedy? So I had started with Pilgrim, and as I was writing Pilgrim, Strabel came into the scene, and I found myself really liking him. And I thought, oh my God, it's my alter ego, like this Swiss policeman, because somehow he just came and I understood the dilemma of being a middle-aged man, not entirely happy in marriage, feeling a little sidelined by new technology, wondering what my skills were, feeling worn down by the years and years of never really being able to make anything different. Just the weariness of middle age, I think. You know, there's that moment when he looks down at his toes and he sees the hair spouting from his toes, and he says something like, you know, the feet of a middle-aged man are horrible.
And he's wearing sandals to touch his down and
exactly.
His toes.
And he's all sweaty. He just feels like this sort of physical. And I think that's because I'm 50. You know, you do kind of, things start to shift physically for you. And so I think I could inhabit the body of a middle-aged man and extrapolate my own things like grey hair. So Strabel sort of came quite naturally. And then Gloria was strangely sprung from some part of me, angry part. I think Gloria is a very angry person. She's always been angry. She's struggled in her life. She lost her son. She struggles with money. She is unattractive. People don't like her. And yet she is determined against all of this to do something good with her life and to resurrect herself through that. And so I really found that nobility within this very angry person, this sense of this determination to overcome all of that and do something good. So I think I sort of fell in love with Gloria's two sides. And then the others, Harry, was very similar. I grew up with giants like Harry sitting on bars. I think most Harry's, and again, actually Harry, can I tell the story? Was actually based on somebody I had done a story about in Tanzania who did end up very sadly committing suicide. But he actually had landed on a remote airstrip at dusk and hit a group of children playing football, thinking they were goats. And I was always wondering if his suicide had maybe begun at that dreadful moment when he had killed those children. I don't know enough about him, and I would never except as a writer, kind of impose that on it. But I felt it must have affected him, just deeply in his soul. And in trouble he was already experiencing psychologically, but that surely must have compounded it. And so even for Harry, I wanted him to find a way out of this utterly useless self-pity that he'd kind of like decided to punish himself by having done this terrible thing. He decided to punish himself by sitting on a bar stool, which is meaningless. It solved nothing. It did nothing. It just wasted his life. And then Dorothea is actually based on a wonderful doctor who I met out there, whose children had been taken by her husband, and she desperately struggled to get them back. And she was a doctor living in the middle of nowhere with barely, I think she had a stethoscope, but that was about it. So.
And it's funny because you described Dorothea, she appears quite early on in such vivid terms. She's a very feisty, short woman who wears, almost to cheer herself up, these bizarre combinations of clothes and jumpsuits and Tinkerbell wigs. And when you read her descriptions, everyone says, wow, you can write. You just got an eye for the most wonderful words, which is one or two words you can just get to know their character and all their eccentricities and everything that makes them unusual. And a question from someone else in the team was, your writing is just so wonderfully descriptive, both in terms of people and in terms of landscape. How can you write so well about landscape? What is your secret? Asked Jennifer from both books.
Well, it's a fantastic compliment. Thank you, Jennifer. I think I spent many years as a journalist, and I think that one of the skills you learn as a journalist is an eye for detail. And I did a lot of travel writing, and I did a lot of profiles, and so I just think you notice small things, most of which are completely irrelevant to a story. But I definitely think that it comes from having been a journalist, and I don't know, just being nosy and being a kid who grew up without television and just sort of attentive to the outer world, and also, quite frankly, traveling a lot when you don't have any media and you're on a bus for 6 hours, you have to notice things. You really do just think about things and observe, and you wait for buses in godforsaken towns in Uganda, and you just observe and notice, because you can only read so much. So.
And do your children, do they grow up with television? Or?
Yes, but I don't think it's television is the sort of evil, the great evil. I think of it as the half hour when I can actually cook supper without being asked to participate in, like making presents for caterpillars or something. So they have about half an hour in the evening, but it's all right. We don't do it big time, but we also don't have any other media in the house. I'm sure that will change as we get older. But I think a lot of time outside, boredom, playing, play toys, that's really important for the imagination.
And one last question, I think, after Shame, what next?
Well,
sounds quite strange out of context, doesn't it? After Shame,
After Shame. A deep breath that will probably last a little bit longer, because as I was saying earlier, Shame really was difficult to write, and it was very emotional. I mean, writing about this tragedy, having my own children, and writing about what I would feel if it was me, which I think every writer has to do. It was very troubling, and the book itself, just the construction of it, was a real battle. So I did a little bit of a breath, but I do have another idea for a novel that will actually be based in Vermont, which is where I live. That's about a woman coming apart, it seems, getting involved in a love affair that she definitely shouldn't be involved in, while her marriage is falling apart. And a few ghosts from the past surfing, a weird guy with a shotgun killing coyotes, and some strange handwriting that she discovers on the wall of a cupboard in a house that she's renting. So
and we can't wait. Thank you so much for coming in. Lovely to talk with you. And Shame is out today. and it's absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you, Sophie, and thank you for publishing the book.